They said Judge Clayton never blinked when handing down punishment. Mercy wasn't part of his vocabulary, especially not for teenagers like Tyler, who stood in that courtroom trembling, voice cracking as he pleaded for a second chance. The judge stared at him with something colder than anger. Then he laughed, not out of amusement, but with that smug confidence that comes from knowing your word is law. What Tyler didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the judge had buried something far worse not long before. His own son had crashed his car into a telephone pole after a night of drinking. No jail. No trial. No headlines. The same man who threw the book at a desperate kid had quietly erased his son's crime from existence until someone started digging. Tyler had never stepped foot inside a courtroom before. Not until that morning. He sat stiffly in a wrinkled button-down shirt, hands clenched in his lap, trying to keep his leg from bouncing. The room was colder than he expected, not just in temperature, but in energy, the kind that made your skin crawl. Eyes from strangers followed him like he didn't belong, like he was already guilty. His mother sat behind him, her hands shaking in her lap, eyes red from crying all night. She hadn't said much during the drive, just kept looking over at her son like she still couldn't believe he was the one standing trial. Tyler had made a mistake, a big one. He'd borrowed a friend's car without asking, gone out late at night, ended up speeding, and clipped the side mirror of a parked vehicle before panicking and driving off. He didn't hurt anyone. The damage was minor. He turned himself in the next morning, heart pounding in his chest, ready to face the consequences. He thought that counted for something. But Judge Clayton didn't care. He was known across the county for being hard. No exceptions, no emotion. The kind of man who saw every case as a chance to prove a point. Parents dreaded landing in his courtroom. Lawyers warned clients to expect the worst. And Tyler, barely 17, was about to find out what that meant. The bailiff called his name and Tyler stood, his knees unsteady beneath him. The room hushed. He walked up to the front and glanced quickly at the man behind the bench. Judge Clayton was older than he looked on TV. Tall, with thinning gray hair, a permanent scowl, and a stare that cut straight through you. He didn't nod, didn't offer a polite word, just adjusted his glasses and began reading the charges in a tone as flat as stone. Tyler listened in silence. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room pressing into his back. When the judge finally asked if he had anything to say, Tyler swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. He didn't have a lawyer. His mom couldn't afford one. He'd been assigned a public defender who barely looked up from his notes. Tyler spoke slowly, carefully, trying to hold himself together. "Your Honor, I know I made a mistake. I was scared. I should have stopped. I turned myself in because I didn't want to run from it. I'm sorry. I've never been in trouble before. I'm asking for a second chance. Please." There was a pause, a long one. Then Judge Clayton leaned back in his chair and let out a laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Dry. He looked down at the boy in front of him like he was amused by the very idea of mercy. "A second chance. You're 17, old enough to know better. You're lucky no one was killed." The courtroom stayed silent. The judge continued, listing off Tyler's mistake like it was a list of moral failures. Irresponsible, dangerous, disrespectful. He talked about sending a message, about how kids today don't understand consequences. And then he handed down the sentence: 6 months in juvenile detention, immediate transfer, no probation. Tyler's mom gasped. Tyler didn't move. He didn't cry. He just stood there, frozen, as the bailiff stepped forward to take him by the arm. The judge didn't even look up again. He was already flipping to the next case file. In the back of the room, someone whispered that it was too much, that the boy didn't deserve it, but no one said it loud enough for the judge to hear. As Tyler was led away, his mother pressed her hand to her mouth and stood slowly, as if part of her was breaking. And behind the bench, Judge Clayton sat with the same cold calm he always carried. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He had made an example. What he didn't know was that someone in that courtroom had seen him before. Not in the courthouse, not in a robe, but in a diner parking lot, weeks ago, pulling his son out of the driver's seat of a dented BMW, whispering frantically at the police officer who had just arrived. and that someone had started remembering. Tyler grew up in a small town where everyone knew your last name and most knew your story before you ever told it. His wasn't a story people envied. His mom worked double shifts at a nursing home, barely keeping food on the table. His dad had left when he was 8. No goodbye, no note. Just a quiet disappearance that never got explained. Tyler learned early not to expect too much from anyone. He wasn't a bad kid, not by any stretch. He helped his mom with groceries, walked his neighbor's dog when her hip started giving out, and tutored a younger kid down the street who struggled with math. But none of that showed up on court papers. What showed up was the single worst decision of his life. The night it happened, Tyler wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't partying or showing off. He was angry. His mom had just told him they couldn't afford to fix the heater again, and winter was creeping in fast. He felt helpless, like every corner they turned was a dead end. He needed air, needed to get out of that tiny apartment for a few minutes before he said something he'd regret. His friend Zach had left his car keys on the kitchen counter after hanging out. Tyler knew it was wrong. He told himself he'd only take it around the block, just to clear his head. No one would even notice. But adrenaline has a way of distorting things. He pressed the gas harder than he meant to. The streets were quiet. No traffic, no people. Then out of nowhere, he misjudged a turn, clipped a parked car, and panicked. His chest tightened. He couldn't think. He drove 2 more blocks before pulling over and sitting in silence, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He went home, didn't sleep, told his mom everything before the sun came up. And the next morning, he walked into the police station and told them what he did. They didn't cuff him. Not at first. The officer seemed surprised. A kid turning himself in wasn't exactly common. They took his statement, asked him to wait in the lobby, then eventually handed the case to the court. No violence, no injuries, no drugs. Just a scared kid who made a dumb choice and came clean. But that wasn't the part that Judge Clayton saw. The judge saw his age, his skin, his clothes. He saw someone to make an example out of, someone who couldn't afford a defense, someone who wouldn't fight back. After the sentencing, Tyler sat in the back of the transport van, wrists shackled lightly, head resting against the window. He didn't cry, not even when the van pulled away, and he saw his mother standing on the curb, holding his jacket in her arms like she didn't know what else to do with her hands. Inside, he felt like something had cracked, not just because of what he'd done, but because of how quickly it had all spiraled. He thought telling the truth would matter. He thought honesty counted for something. But for Judge Clayton, Tyler wasn't a person. He was a headline waiting to happen. And the judge wasn't about to let the papers say he went soft. That was the story the public saw. A troubled teen caught in the act. A judge who did what needed to be done. But across town, inside a gated neighborhood with manicured lawns and security cameras on every corner, there was another teenager with a story no one was telling. A teenager who hadn't walked into a police station, who hadn't been honest, who had done something far worse and never faced a single consequence. And the man who made sure of that was the same one who just laughed at Tyler's plea for mercy. If you're feeling drawn into Tyler's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These are the kinds of stories we bring to light, stories that deserve to be heard. Judge Malcolm Clayton built his reputation the old-fashioned way, by being feared. He didn't smile in photos. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't do charity events or school visits. He believed in rules, punishment, and control, and he carried himself like the courtroom belonged to him alone. In his mind, he wasn't just interpreting the law. He was the law. Locals called him the Iron Gavel. Once he made up his mind, there was no appeal, no second hearing, no hesitation. His courtroom was known for quick decisions and long sentences. Lawyers warned clients to pray they didn't get assigned to him. Parents told their kids that if they messed up, Clayton would make sure they never did it again. But Clayton didn't care about his reputation, not in the way most public figures do. He cared about power, the quiet kind, the kind that made men lower their eyes in elevators, that made police chiefs return his calls in under 5 minutes, that made people hesitate before ever questioning his judgment. He wore the robe like armor, never took it off in public. He drove a black sedan with tinted windows, parked in a reserved space behind the courthouse, entered through a private door. He had breakfast at the same diner every morning, reading the paper without speaking a word to anyone. When the waitress brought his coffee, she knew not to ask about his day. He liked his silence. He liked control. Behind closed doors, he kept his private life exactly that private. He had one son, Drew Clayton, 18 years old, senior in high school. The boy kept a low profile, played lacrosse, made average grades. People didn't know much about him, and that was intentional. The judge didn't speak about family. In fact, no one in town had even met the mother. Rumor had it she left years ago. Some said she passed away. No one really knew. At work, Judge Clayton demanded discipline. He scolded attorneys for sloppy arguments. He once fined a juror for showing up late. He suspended a bailiff for chewing gum during proceedings. Everything had to be in order. Everything had to be sharp, precise, under control. And then there was how he dealt with minors. He believed leniency created weakness. In his view, the moment a teenager made a mistake, the most important thing was to make an example. He once sentenced a 16-year-old to 3 months for shoplifting a pair of sneakers, claimed it was to deter others, claimed it was the only way to stop the cycle. But what the public didn't see, what they never even thought to question, was how selective that judgment really was. Because Judge Clayton had a rule: punish the kids who couldn't fight back, the ones without fathers, the ones with public defenders, the ones like Tyler. Drew was different. At home, Clayton kept a close eye on his son, but not out of love, out of image. Drew was a reflection of him, and Judge Clayton's name had to stay clean. No rumors, no stains, no weakness. So when Drew started partying more, sneaking out, drinking with friends in secret, Clayton didn't punish him. He warned him, quietly, privately, with the kind of tone that didn't leave bruises but left something worse: fear. He told his son that if he ever embarrassed the family name, it wouldn't be the law that came for him. It would be his father. But boys who grow up in the shadows of powerful men learn how to lie, and Drew had gotten good at it. One Friday night, Drew had a few too many at a house party just outside town. He insisted he was fine to drive. He wasn't. A mile down the road, he lost control and crashed his car into a telephone pole. No one else was hurt, but the damage was obvious. A neighbor heard the noise and called the police. When they arrived, Drew was still in the driver's seat, eyes glassy, breath thick with alcohol. But within 15 minutes, Judge Clayton was on the scene, not as a father, as a fixer. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He spoke quietly to the officer, used names, called in a favor, and by the time the report was filed, Drew's name had vanished. The car was towed to a private lot, the report marked as property damage only, and the story buried. What Tyler never knew, as he stood shaking in that courtroom, was that just 2 weeks earlier, the same man who laughed at his plea for mercy had broken the law in the name of protecting his own, and someone else had seen it happen. The courtroom was nearly full that day. A couple of journalists sat near the back with notebooks resting on their laps. A few lawyers waited quietly for their cases to be called. There were 2 high school teachers there too, sitting together in silence, one of them holding a letter Tyler's classmates had signed asking for leniency. Tyler sat alone at the defendant's table. His public defender had stepped out briefly to take a phone call. He stared at the floor, hands still cuffed in front of him. His shoulders were tense, but low, like he had already accepted whatever was coming. His mother sat behind him, lips pressed tight, fingers clutching the strap of her purse so hard her knuckles had turned white. She had been calling around all week, asking friends, neighbors, even their pastor to write letters on Tyler's behalf. She had shown up to court that day with a folder full of them. No one asked to read them. Judge Clayton entered 5 minutes late. No apology, no acknowledgement of the crowd. He took his seat, adjusted his robe, and asked the clerk to proceed. The charges were read again. Unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, reckless driving, leaving the scene of an accident, damage to property. No one had been hurt. The damage was estimated at less than $1,000. Tyler had turned himself in less than 12 hours later. But Clayton's tone didn't soften. He asked the public defender if the boy had anything to say. Tyler stood. His voice cracked a little, but he spoke clearly. He said he was sorry, said he understood what he did was wrong, said he didn't run because he wanted to escape, but because he was scared, that he'd gone straight home, told the truth, and that he'd never even had a traffic ticket before this. The courtroom was quiet. Even the reporters looked up. For a moment, there was a pause. Then Clayton leaned forward and delivered a statement that no one would forget. He said the law did not bend for emotion. He said young people needed to learn that their actions had weight. He said being sorry did not undo consequences. Then he looked straight at Tyler and said, "You're not a child. You're old enough to understand what you did, and you're old enough to pay for it." And then he delivered the sentence: 6 months in juvenile detention. Immediate custody. No probation. No time served. No community service. Just jail. The air seemed to get sucked out of the room. Tyler didn't move. His mother let out a soft sound, somewhere between a cry and a gasp. The teachers looked at each other in disbelief. One of the reporters lowered his pen and just stared. The bailiff moved toward Tyler. He stood up slowly, hands still cuffed, eyes wide but dry. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just turned to look at his mother once, her face covered in shock and disbelief, and then allowed himself to be led away. Judge Clayton did not look back. He was already reaching for the next file. Outside the courtroom, conversations started to swirl. A few people said it felt too harsh. Others whispered that maybe the judge was just tired of kids getting off easy. But deep down, even those who believed in tough justice felt something wasn't right. There was no prior record, no resistance, no arrogance, just a scared kid who made a mistake and came clean. And yet, he was treated like a warning to others, like a symbol, not a human. One of the reporters later wrote in his notebook that it felt more like theater than justice, that the sentence had weight, but no soul. What no one knew at that time was that someone in the back row had taken a photo, not of Tyler, but of the judge, the moment after the sentence, the look in his eyes, the calm certainty, the complete absence of empathy. That someone didn't know exactly what they were looking for yet, but they felt something off, something cold, something wrong, and they were about to start asking questions. It started with whispers, the kind that drifted across diner counters and behind church doors, the kind that never got printed but passed between people like wind through leaves. No one said it too loud, but the tone was unmistakable. Something about that boy's sentence didn't feel right. In a town that small, people notice everything. The grocery clerk had seen Tyler helping his mom carry bags every Saturday morning. The librarian remembered how polite he was when returning books. Even the mechanic had a soft spot for the kid who once shoveled snow from his shop entrance without being asked. The news didn't make national headlines, but the local paper printed a short piece. 17-year-old sentenced to 6 months in juvenile detention for reckless driving. No injuries. Minor damage. Voluntary confession. No prior record. The comments section was split. Some said good. Actions have consequences. Others felt sick. Said it was too much. Said the boy should have been given another chance. One teacher who had written a letter on Tyler's behalf stopped by the courthouse the next day to ask if the judge had ever read it. The clerk at the front desk said she didn't know. The letter hadn't been mentioned in the hearing. 3 days later, another parent brought it up during a school board meeting. Not as a formal complaint, just a passing comment. But it stuck. People began to remember other kids who had come before Judge Clayton. A girl caught shoplifting makeup who got 60 days. A boy who skipped probation meetings and ended up behind bars for nearly a year. It wasn't just that he was tough. It was how selective it seemed. How the punishment never quite fit the person, only the image he wanted to protect. Then came the phone call. A court clerk who had worked under Clayton for over a decade reached out to someone she trusted. A friend of a friend. Said she didn't want to be involved officially. Didn't want to lose her job. But she had seen something. Something that had been bothering her. She remembered a file. One that had vanished. It wasn't unusual for minor cases to come and go. But this one stood out because of the name. Drew Clayton, the judge's son. She'd seen it late one night, logged in the digital case system. It had been flagged briefly for a DUI arrest. She didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe another Clayton. But when she went to check it again the next day, it was gone. Not sealed. Gone. She hadn't spoken about it to anyone. Not until she read about Tyler's sentence and saw the same judge hand down jail time to a kid for doing far less. The person she told wasn't a reporter. Not at first. Just someone who knew how to look up public records. Someone who still had friends in the police department. They started asking quiet questions. Was there ever an incident involving Drew Clayton? Any reports filed? Any accident logs? Most officers didn't remember anything. Some said no. Others hesitated. But one said yes. He remembered that night. A black BMW crashed into a utility pole just outside of town. The driver was clearly intoxicated. The officer had started taking the report when a second car pulled up fast. Judge Clayton stepped out. The officer didn't want to talk more than that. Said he was warned never to mention it again. But he remembered how fast the scene was cleared. How the report was handled off the books. How no charges were filed. And just like that, the whispers turned into something more. There was a crack in the armor. A possibility that the man known for his harsh justice might be hiding a secret. And in that possibility, people began to wonder if he covered up his own son's crime, how many others had been silenced, and who else might have suffered because of it. Her name was Linda. Most people in the courthouse barely noticed her. She kept to herself, arrived early, left late, never raised her voice. She had worked there for over 16 years. Files, schedules, transcripts, internal emails, all of it passed through her hands. And because she was quiet, people forgot she was watching. Linda wasn't the type to spread gossip, but after Tyler's sentencing, she couldn't sleep. Something about the way Judge Clayton looked at that boy haunted her. Not because it was new, but because it wasn't. She'd seen that same cold stare dozens of times before, and something inside her finally snapped. She didn't go to the police. She didn't go to her supervisor. She went to someone she trusted. A neighbor whose sister worked for a local podcast that covered small-town stories and local scandals. Linda didn't want her name used. She didn't want to be dragged into anything. But she had information, and she was tired of pretending it didn't matter. She remembered the file, a digital case record that had appeared one afternoon for less than 24 hours. Driving under the influence, minor accident, suspect listed as Drew Clayton, age 18, no injuries. Property damage, filed under the county's internal system, then gone the next morning without explanation. Linda had looked for it again. Gone. She checked the backups. Still nothing. Normally, even sealed cases left a digital trace. But this one had vanished entirely. Erased, not hidden. That wasn't standard procedure. That wasn't a clerical error. That was intentional. And it wasn't the first time Linda had seen something like it. Years earlier, another file had disappeared under strange circumstances. A weapons charge against the nephew of a city councilman. Back then, she had ignored it, told herself it wasn't her place. But this time was different, because Tyler reminded her of her own son, same age, same nervous hands, same look in the eyes when the world stops feeling fair. She handed over what she remembered. Dates, times, case numbers, a short list of names that had access to the deletion system, and one detail she hadn't told anyone. On the night Drew's file vanished, the only person logged into the system after hours was Judge Clayton. The podcast producer wasn't a legal expert, but she knew a good story when she saw one. She passed it to a journalist she had worked with before, someone who didn't mind poking the bear. The investigation began quietly, pulling records, requesting access logs, interviewing off-duty officers. The goal wasn't to take down a judge. It was to find the truth, to find out how many lines had been crossed and who had paid the price. Meanwhile, Linda kept working like nothing had changed. She filed motions, scheduled hearings, passed notes back and forth between courtrooms. But every time she saw Clayton step onto the bench, she felt the weight of what she knew pressed down harder on her chest. She started noticing things she hadn't before. Which cases the judge took personal interest in, which files were rerouted, which decisions were made without review, and how often those choices seemed to protect the powerful while punishing the powerless. The courthouse ran like a machine, but Linda had finally seen the gears underneath, and they were dirtier than anyone wanted to admit. The story wasn't public yet, but it was growing, and for the first time in over a decade, Judge Clayton had no idea someone inside his own walls was watching, someone who had finally had enough, and someone who had just given the first real crack in the shield. He had built around himself for years. The crash happened just after midnight on a Saturday. No rain, no fog, just silence and the low rumble of a car engine pushed too hard down an empty stretch of road. Drew Clayton had left a party less than 15 minutes earlier. Friends told him not to drive. He laughed it off, said he was fine, said he knew the roads better than anyone. But alcohol changes your sense of control. And when the turn came to sharp, he didn't make it. The BMW clipped a sidewalk, spun once, then slammed into a telephone pole hard enough to trigger the airbag. Smoke hissed from the engine. Drew sat stunned, blinking blood out of his eye, hand trembling as he reached for his phone. He didn't call 911. He called his father. Judge Clayton was at the scene within 15 minutes. Not in his robe, not with a courtroom stare. Just a man in a long coat, jaw tight, eyes scanning everything like a checklist. He parked far from the flashing lights and walked over slowly. The officer on duty recognized him immediately. It wasn't a conversation. It was a command, disguised as calm. The officer stepped back when Clayton spoke, not because he was convinced, but because the air changed when the judge arrived. Everything felt heavier, more dangerous, like careers could vanish in a sentence. The judge asked to speak privately. He leaned in close, used the officer's name, reminded him of past favors, mentioned promotions, connections, the reputation of the department, the risk of paperwork getting into the wrong hands. And then he offered a version of the story that didn't include alcohol, that didn't include Drew behind the wheel, that didn't include any crime at all. He said it could be handled quietly, that the boy was shaken but unhurt, that the car would be towed privately, that no breath test was necessary, that there were no drugs, no injuries, no victims. The officer hesitated, then handed over the notepad without a word. By morning, the report was rewritten, the call logs updated. The dashcam footage never surfaced. The car was towed by a company the judge had worked with before. No official booking, no public record. The file created that night was deleted by noon the next day. Drew stayed home from school for a week. A friend said he had a concussion. Another said he had the flu. Nobody questioned it, but one neighbor saw the damage. The crumpled front end of the car parked briefly behind the house. The way Judge Clayton paced outside on his phone late into the night. The tension in his posture. The silence around it. And now, weeks later, with Tyler locked away for something far less serious, those details began to matter. The reporter digging into the story finally tracked down the officer who'd been on duty that night. At first, he denied it, said he didn't remember, said maybe it was another incident. But when pressed, when asked if he had ever been at a scene with Judge Clayton that never made it to the public logs, the silence said more than words. He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. The reporter wrote down everything: the missing file, the altered report, the officer's silence, the neighbor's observation, and the name of the towing company, which had no record of that night's pickup, but did show a blank invoice marked urgent and paid in full. A narrative was forming, one that couldn't be ignored much longer. The cover-up wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a pattern. Judge Clayton had used his power to erase a crime, and then stood in a courtroom and laughed at a boy who had done the opposite. A boy who had told the truth. A boy who asked for mercy and was shown none. And somewhere out there, that boy's life was still on hold, locked behind cold walls for something that never even had a chance to be forgiven. While Drew Clayton was free. No charges, no consequences, no scars, just silence. Until now. The story broke quietly at first. A small blog post. Local, titled simply "The Judge and the Hidden File." It didn't accuse. It questioned, raised concerns, asked why a DUI involving the judge's son had no official record, why a case that briefly appeared in the system had vanished, why a teenager who turned himself in was punished more harshly than someone who never faced the law at all. Most people ignored it. At first. But in a town like theirs, where everyone talked and no secret stayed buried forever, it didn't stay quiet long. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by a larger outlet, then another. A podcast ran a short segment connecting Tyler's sentencing to the judge's rumored interference. And just like that, the image of Judge Clayton started to crack. People who once feared him began to speak. Former clerks, defense attorneys, even one retired police captain. They all had stories, hints, moments they remembered but hadn't pieced together until now. Files that disappeared, cases reassigned, witnesses not called, pressure applied behind closed doors. Nothing big enough to call evidence, but enough to form a pattern. The courthouse began to feel different. There was tension in the hallways, whispers behind office doors, reporters waiting outside, cameras ready. Staff started double-checking every file, every timestamp. Some tried to defend him, said it was just politics, a smear job, but others had seen too much for too long. At home, Judge Clayton pretended nothing had changed. He still left the house at 6:30 sharp, still ate his toast dry and read the paper at the kitchen table without looking at his son. Drew barely spoke. He hadn't since the night of the crash. Not really. There were no thank yous, no apologies, just silence. He knew what his father had done, and in some ways, that was worse than facing the law, because now he was trapped, not just in the house, but inside a lie that was starting to crumble. Meanwhile, Tyler sat alone in his cell, unaware that the world outside was finally beginning to question the sentence that stole 6 months of his life. He hadn't had visitors in 2 weeks. His letters went unanswered. His mother was doing everything she could to stay strong, but it was getting harder by the day, until she received a call. It was the journalist. He told her the story was growing, that people were starting to listen, that something was happening. She didn't cry. She didn't celebrate. She just asked if it was too late for her son, and the journalist said no, not yet. By the end of the week, the local news station aired a special segment, half an hour dedicated to the pattern of judicial overreach and possible corruption. They didn't name names at first, but everyone knew who it was about. The pressure was mounting. A formal complaint was filed with the State Judicial Commission, not by a politician, not by a lawyer, but by a group of parents, teachers, and concerned citizens. Over 100 signatures, demanding an investigation into Judge Clayton's conduct. And while the judge kept his head down, the system he had once controlled so tightly began to loosen its grip. The clerk who once feared losing her job was asked to testify. The officer who stayed silent the night of the crash was placed on administrative leave. And Drew Clayton, now 18, was called in for questioning. The walls were closing in. The courtroom that once felt like a throne now felt like a trap. And Judge Clayton, who used to speak with absolute authority, found himself surrounded by questions he could no longer dismiss. For years, he had built his power on silence, on fear, on control. But now, silence had become suspicion, and fear had become outrage, and control was slipping through his fingers faster than he ever imagined. By the end of the month, Judge Clayton's name was everywhere, not in celebration, not in praise, but in headlines. A local watchdog group published a detailed timeline connecting over a dozen questionable sentencing decisions made in Clayton's courtroom. Patterns began to emerge. Harsh punishments handed down to minors from lower-income families. Cases that seemed rushed. Testimonies that were never heard. All while a few privileged names always managed to vanish from the docket without explanation. The story of Drew's DUI wasn't a rumor anymore. It was on paper. An official complaint outlined the deleted case record, the missing report, and the officer's statement confirming Clayton's presence at the crash scene. The towing company, once silent, finally produced an invoice marked confidential and paid in full by a private account, traced back to the judge's office. The house Clayton had kept so quiet for so long was now surrounded by camera crews. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Reporters followed his car. Every step he took outside felt watched. Inside the courthouse, a different silence had settled. No one greeted him in the hall. No one made eye contact. Staff who once walked in his shadow now avoided him entirely. And then the unthinkable happened. He was suspended. A temporary order, pending investigation. Effective immediately. His docket cleared. His chambers sealed. His name removed from the official listing on the county website. The gavel that once struck fear now sat in an empty courtroom. The moment it was announced, something shifted across the town. Teachers who had written letters for Tyler finally spoke to the press. Classmates shared how he had never been the type to act out. Even former defendants began to reach out, wondering if their cases might be worth revisiting. The public defender who had represented Tyler filed a motion for sentence review. The motion cited excessive punishment, lack of judicial neutrality, and new evidence of misconduct by the presiding judge. The court scheduled a hearing. When Tyler walked into the room weeks later, his eyes looked older. Not tired, not angry, just changed. He wore a plain shirt, his hands no longer cuffed, his posture more guarded than before. His mother sat behind him again, this time surrounded by people who had come not to judge, but to support. The hearing was brief. The evidence spoke for itself. Within 20 minutes, Tyler's sentence was overturned. The judge presiding that day looked at him and said one simple thing: "This should never have happened." Tyler didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just nodded once and walked out the same way he came in, quietly, carefully, as if waiting to wake up from a long, strange dream. Outside the courthouse, people applauded, not because justice had been perfectly served, but because, for once, the system had corrected itself. As for Judge Clayton, the investigation didn't stop at suspension. The state launched a full inquiry into his conduct, reviewing years of sentencing records. Dozens of cases were reopened. Some defendants were offered reduced sentences. Others were fully exonerated. Clayton was called to testify in front of a judicial ethics committee. He arrived in a dark suit, alone, with no press statement, no attorney by his side. He refused to admit wrongdoing. He claimed he did what he thought was right, but the truth no longer needed his permission to exist. His son, Drew, eventually gave a quiet statement to the commission. He didn't defend his father. He didn't accuse him either. He simply told the truth, and in doing so, ended the silence. The story wasn't about one bad sentence anymore. It was about power and how easily it could be twisted when no one was watching. About the people who had been crushed beneath it, and about the ones who finally stood up to pull back the curtain. The community had seen what happened when justice lost its way, and they had decided not to look away again. Months passed. Judge Clayton no longer lived in town. After the investigation, he resigned quietly, avoiding the noise of a public trial. There were no handcuffs, no mugshots, no perp walk through the courthouse where he once ruled with absolute control. His resignation came with no admission of guilt, just a statement filled with carefully chosen words about stepping away to protect the integrity of the judiciary. To many, it felt like he got away with it. No prison, no criminal record, no punishment equal to the lives he damaged. Drew went on to attend college out of state. The whispers followed, but the scandal faded from headlines. In time, new stories took its place. But for Tyler, the story never really ended. He came home to a town that saw him differently now, not as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol of what happens when truth is ignored, of how easily justice can be turned into a weapon. He didn't talk much about what happened inside juvenile detention. He didn't need to. It was written in the way he moved, a little slower, a little more careful. He worked part-time at a mechanic shop, started taking night classes, stayed out of the spotlight, but people noticed him now, spoke to him with more respect. Teachers invited him to speak at local schools. A scholarship fund was started in his name by the same community that once watched him walk into court alone. Still, a question lingered in the air long after Clayton's resignation. Was justice truly served? Tyler was free, yes, but months of his life were gone. Time he would never get back. Memories that never should have happened. He had been branded a criminal while the real one went home with a warning and a clean record. And Judge Clayton? He lost his title, his reputation, but not his freedom. For some, that was enough. For others, it was one more reminder that when power protects itself, accountability rarely follows. Yet something had changed. The silence was broken. Because one clerk spoke up. Because one reporter didn't stop digging. Because a community finally stopped trusting a name and started asking questions. Tyler's case led to broader reforms. A new judge was appointed, one who promised transparency, fairness, and a full review of past cases. A new policy was enacted to prevent unauthorized deletions in the court's digital system, and the police department implemented mandatory body cam footage storage with external oversight. All because one boy refused to lie, and because one man in power believed he was untouchable. In the end, the story wasn't just about punishment. It was about exposure, about what happens when people stop turning away and start holding those at the top accountable. Justice didn't come in a single headline. It came slowly, through pressure, through truth, through voices that refused to be silenced. And in that, maybe, there was something greater than punishment. There was change. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and explore the other stories we tell. Stories about truth, injustice, redemption, and resilience. Your support helps these voices be heard.